Hello, and welcome to Chrononauts, a science fiction literature history podcast. I'm JM, and here with Gretchen and Nate, and we're talking about the family and fertility, and we've got 4 stories lined up of varying lengths. We just did an intro segment, followed by a discussion of David H. Keller, MD's Mr. Baby Man himself, and his story, Unto Us a Child is Born. So if you want to hear the opening remarks, definitely listen to that episode. But now, though, we're going to be talking about Judith Josephine Grossman. She was born in 1923 in Boston. She's known in the science fiction world and elsewhere as Judith Merril, and this is the pen name she adopted in the late 1960s as her official name. But yeah, she was born Judith Josephine Grossman in Boston, Massachusetts, USA in 1923. So, in the 50s and 60s, she was an important figure in SF, as she liked to call it, as a writer, but especially as an anthologist. She compiled the year's greatest SF stories from 1956 to 1967, and put together several other anthologies as well, including one showcasing Britain during the New Wave period. England Swings SF, living briefly in that country in 1967. Things got increasingly uncomfortable for her in the U.S. with Vietnam and stuff, and she was always deeply involved in left-wing politics. So she moved to Canada during this time to my home city of Toronto, in fact, to participate in Rochdale College, a free university that unfortunately no longer exists and didn't last very long. Basically, as you can sadly imagine, it was shut down because it was unable to finance itself. And yeah, because it was a cooperative institution with everybody kind of living together, the people in the neighborhood started to notice there was a lot of drug taking and other unruliness. And I guess the whole thing was maybe something to be considered a failed experiment, but good intentions for sure. But during that 1956-1967 period, she organized a writers' conference in Milford, Pennsylvania, with Damon and James Blish. And she was married 3 times, and her second husband was Frederick Pohl, whose name has certainly come up a lot in the past, and will no doubt do so again. And together with Pohl, she started what they called the Hydra Club, which was basically another SF writers' meetup, including editors and publishers. And lots of people would attend, including Isaac Asimov and Willy Ley. Worth pointing out, just because we just spent a lot of time talking about him recently and his interesting attitudes, she had an affair with Fritz Leiber when they were both married, and she talks about him a lot in her memoirs, and obviously was extremely fond of the guy. So a lot of the info for this I drew from basically her unfinished posthumous memoirs, which are entitled Better to Have Loved, The Life of Judith Merril, and these were put together by her granddaughter, Emily Pohl-Weary. And kind of an interesting experience reading the memoirs. They're unfinished, and Emily does talk a lot about what she did in order to prepare the work, and the various internal conflicts she had about which things she should include and what she might have to leave out.
Right, I bet.
Yeah, so Merril was I'll get into this a little later, but certainly a figure that was very opinionated and I guess maybe caused a lot of friction with other people sometimes. And I think from what Emily Pohl-Weary says in the memoir, she had written down a lot of stuff that was, I guess, stories and anecdotes that went differently than what other people told, and she had to decide what parts she should kind of tone down a bit. And so it's kind of interesting to read because a lot of the memoirs do seem, you can really feel that unfinished aspect. It's a little bit rambly. It's mostly Judith's stuff herself because she did write a lot of the pieces. But according to Emily, Judith didn't want to finish it because she thought once she finished her memoirs, that would kind of be it. And she would have nothing else to write about. And she didn't really write much fiction after 1960. And this was a project that Emily agreed to work on and said she would finish herself. she did do. But yeah, there's a lot of letters from various people and from her correspondence. A lot of people in the SF community, so it's kind of interesting to read that stuff. There's some letters from Leiber in there. There's letters from Theodore Sturgeon. She has a whole chapter dedicated to him. Really kind of inspired her as a writer and helped her out in a lot of ways, so she's very grateful to that. So yeah, she was friends with lots of people, but maybe made some enemies too, and she was certainly one to burn bridges, according to her granddaughter. Going back to her childhood, Judith's father killed himself in 1929, jumping out of a window. It seems like a lot of people were doing that in 1929. I always thought maybe it was a little bit exaggerated, but apparently he actually did. In 1936, Judith and her mother moved to New York, the Bronx, where her mother ran a home for delinquent children, and this wasn't apparently very good for young Judith, so they thought. So they found her another place to stay a few blocks away with another woman. Interestingly, this was Jack London's widow, and this didn't go well either, as, according to Judith, she was always too dirty, too messy for this severe, meticulous woman. So her grandfather was a renowned rabbi in the Jewish community, and as a young person, she was very interested in Zionism. But she made what she described as a typical Jewish American intellectual's path from Zionism to socialism to Trotskyism. And in the late 1930s, she was really into communism, which is how she met husband number one eventually. She hated Stalinism from the beginning and considered herself a Trotskyist, but she ended up leaving any semblance of that organization too, because she said she found their authoritarian organizational tactics unbearable. Of course, this was largely during the Depression, and communism was pretty common in the Bronx, the way she tells it, and there weren't the sort of roundups you got after World War II. She held down a few jobs and had her first daughter in 1942, and she was moving all over the country in 42, 43 to be with her husband, pretty much bases all over the United States. And she said they must have moved 7 times. But then Dan was sent overseas, and that's when she started meeting people in the SF community. So she became good friends with the editor and agent, Virginia Kidd, and they lived together for a while with their 2 daughters. And Dan does come back from the war, and they try to make things work, but the marriage is broken, and they separate. So, like I said before, Judith Merril is her pen name, Merril being actually her daughter's first name. And apparently it was Ted Sturgeon who suggested this name in the first place. But her first published stories are actually sports tales and some pulps under various pseudonyms, all male. And she was a researcher by this time and getting into this pulp ghostwriting business. That Only a Mother was her first sale to an SF magazine, and that's tonight's story. So in 1946, she and Pohl met, like I said before, and they quickly moved in together. And they would eventually get married, and this lasted until 1951. And her career as an editor, meanwhile, started in 47 when she applied for the position of mystery editor at the fledgling Bantam Publishing. They wanted an experienced editor, and she had none. So she was pretty surprised when she got the job, but it turned out it was because she already had connections through the Scott Meredith Literary Agency and all the people she'd met in her moving around in various circles. And Bantam was mostly doing reprints then, and she kept up this till 1950 when she quit to work on her novel, which was published by Doubleday. And she left her mark on Bantam, though, and she persuaded them to publish a science fiction anthology, very rare for 1950. And it was somewhat amusingly titled A Shot in the Dark, which was probably exactly what they thought it was. And the novel was not a qualified success as far as Judith was concerned, although it got a favorable review in the New York Times and ended up being televised as Atomic Attack. Doubleday changed the title to something really innocuous and non-specific, Shadow on the Hearth, which could have been anything, and barely promoted the book, and changed the ending without her consent. In her writing, she was into doing collaborations, as in the 1950s. Her favorite writer to collaborate with was Cyril C.M. Kornbluth, and they published quite a lot together under the name Cyril Judd. Many of these were serialized in Astounding. And she speaks of two major influences on getting her going: Theodore Sturgeon and Anthony Boucher. And Boucher was an editor and writer, and he was co-founder of the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, which is a magazine that we've mentioned before and featured at least 2 stories from, and it's one that Judith seems to have really liked. By 1952, she and Fred were already separated, and she would marry again in another 10 years. This time, another guy named Dan, this time not a writer, and that didn't last long either. They decided to live separately. So she seemed to mostly like Canada, which is where she moved in the late 60s. And yeah, she has her collection, formerly called the Spaced Out Collection, which she donated to the Toronto Public Library in 1970. And she's kind of involved in politics too, being involved in committee organizing relief for refugees from militarism. She was really busy, and in fact was responsible for a lot of stuff that I probably experienced somewhat as a kid and didn't really realize that the person was involved was Judith Merril or know her name at that time. So she wrote a lot of scripts for the show Ideas, which was a CBC radio documentary about all kinds of interesting art and science topics that used to air on the weekdays. And I remember it well, although she was probably gone by the time I mostly heard it in the early 90s. She taught science fiction seminars at various alternative schools in the Toronto area. And yeah, interestingly, she worked for TV Ontario as well for a while, which was the station on which I first saw Doctor Who. And she did these short documentaries, no longer than about 7 minutes, that were aired after Doctor Who was on. And I'd completely forgotten about these, but reading about this now, yeah, I remember seeing some of these. A lot of them were about science stuff. And they kind of seemed like maybe a bit child-friendly, and I'm guessing they had probably little animations and stuff, but I'm not really sure. And yeah, I remember seeing them, some of these. So they were still showing some of these in 86, 87 probably, is when not long after I first started watching that show. But
yeah, it's pretty cool.
Yeah. Also, a Canadian publisher put out her collection Survival Ship and Other Stories in 1978, and that's probably why that story was actually part of my 9th grade English curriculum. And again, I didn't know Judith Merril's name at that time, and I wouldn't have been able to tell you who wrote the story unless I saw a reference to it. And I'm like, yeah, I remember reading that story. And okay, so that was her too. But it's kind of an interesting story because it's about a ship in the future. I think it's going to a colony or something like that, or they're trying to start a new life away from a decimated Earth. And it's a story written completely without gender pronouns. So I think part of the whole idea of it being a class work was like people probably made a lot of assumptions about it based on that. The fact that it didn't have any gender pronouns, how long does it take you to notice that, right? I guess. I don't know. I can't exactly remember because 9th grade was a long time ago, but it's kind of interesting. So, she also made it into the Best American Short Stories book, edited by Martha Foley of 1955. Worth noting, this was a story called Dead Center, which was about a moon landing and the people involved in particular. So, yeah, a lot of moon landing stories before, but she was definitely focusing on the human angle and both the guy on the rocket, but also his family and other scientists working on the ground and stuff like that, many of whom were women. And she didn't comment on that, just like assumed that they would just be working with the men and they wouldn't even like be an issue, which I think that a lot of her male counterparts in the 50s were not quite maybe able to handle yet. So, yeah. Starting in the mid-80s, like a number of Canadians, she decided to winter in warmer climes and would spend half the year in Jamaica. She's still really active teaching in Toronto, especially at Seed Alternative High School. And she got back into editing anthologies by 1985, publishing Tesseract, which is the first anthology of Canadian science fiction. And it lasted for a long time. I'm not sure if it's still going. I meant to check on that, but yeah, I've kind of been thinking of looking at it because I've never really taken the time to get into it, and maybe there'll be some cool stories for us to do on the podcast at some point. So I guess we should talk about Merril on sex and feminism because it's sort of relevant to the topic. She writes about this quite a bit in her memoirs, and it's a complicated thing, and sometimes one gets the idea that she's being a little defensive. She had what might have been called at one time a reputation, and this maybe did tend to contribute to throwing her personal life into some upheaval. And certainly, I don't mean to be critical when I say this, but this is certainly something that her granddaughter also comments on. And the science fiction community in New York was very close-knit, and everybody knew each other, and I guess there was certainly Damon Knight's Futurians book, too. There's an awful lot of gossip of who was sleeping with who, and I don't know. It seems like everybody was sleeping with everybody, so I'm not necessarily going to, again, criticize one person, but there was only really 2 or 3 women mostly involved in the group. And Merril herself commented, it was like they didn't know any other women. So, in any case, she says this in her memoirs. I'm going to read a couple of sections. She says, I didn't do that much sleeping around, so I find myself reacting defensively, much the way I would have if I had known what people were saying at the time. But now my defensiveness is for a different reason. I feel defensive in the face of women who are convinced that all heterosexual gender politics are exploitative. I suppose in my life there have been times when my partner and I were exploiting each other consensually, but that's called a trait. Certainly I feel I came out of every relationship richer, intellectually and creatively than when I entered it. I am still struggling with how to present this fact, without either sounding like a naive know-nothing, to whom any man could say anything and make me feel like I've gained something, or seeming to apologize for being heterosexual, which I am perfectly willing to apologize for. I think everybody should be bisexual. Often physical acts of love make other kinds of communication between men and women easier. This is only true when lovemaking is distinguished from those relationships that involve perspective and future expectations or possession, because those things make acts of love all much more difficult. I believe there is an inequality between the sexes, but that a lot of the inequality is in the minds of women who have been raised and trained and conditioned to believe that men have more power and will always be sexually exploitative. I don't mean that it's only in the minds of women, but that part of the problem is that women are prepared to accept unacceptable behavior. If women expect that they must behave in certain ways, then they often put themselves in the position of having to behave in these ways, even if the man they are with is not trying to set up such a situation. Basically, I think there are 3 main ways in which men are oppressed in our society. They are taught not to have emotions, to separate their bodies from their intellects, and to be competitive and aggressive. Part of what has made my view different from that of most feminists is that I was not given the same conditioning when I grew up. My mother was already a feminist from the first wave, and I didn't have a father. There was no male protecting me and telling me I was beautiful. She goes on to relate her reading of a story by Fritz Leiber for his mimeographed fanzine in 1952, The Nice Girl with 5 Husbands, a short utopian story, and she says she sometimes fondly thought of herself in that way. See, in the early 50s, she lived in a small town, Milford, PA, while undergoing really bitter-seeming custody battles over both her children. And she says this was a very difficult time, and they were always being watched and needed to present the front of the ideal American family. Only there was no husband in the house. She relates her social, intellectual, and sexual frustration. And yeah, it does seem like this was a really bad time from the way she tells it. Both ex-husbands with the 2 different daughters got together and ganged up on her and hired a bunch of lawyers, and she was totally broke. And
yeah,
it sounds like it was really, really awful. And,
I can imagine.
Yeah.
But Virginia Kidd was actually the wife of James Blish, who she always calls Jim. And she and Virginia were good friends, but apparently Merril and James Blish didn't get along, according to how she says it, anyway. But she does write a lot about control and possessiveness, and how she thinks possessiveness is at the root of many problems between the sexes, especially when related to things like marriage. Unsurprisingly, she takes these thoughts to some unusual places, and while I won't do any more quotes of that stuff from here, it'd be interesting to see what someone more versed in, I guess, feminism and gender politics might have to say about some of this stuff, especially from a 21st century perspective. But it's there in the East Village with her infant daughter, Merril, that she was really getting into SF, and she met up with the Futurians. And she described them as mostly left-wing. And she writes a lot about fandoms, fanzines, and the community aspect, especially in New York around this time, mostly the 40s. And of course, she had her own fanzine, The Temper, which changed the titles every month, depending on how she was feeling. But it was always something like that, like distemper. And yeah, she describes a lot of political infighting. And I'm sure everybody has their own story. But getting on to tonight's story, That Only a Mother, Judith Merril has a brief piece that she calls Give the Girls a Break, after a common slogan at the time, Give the Boys a Break. And I'm going to read this, kind of pretty relevant to tonight's whole topic, and I think it gives a very different perspective than somebody like Keller. And I think you can tell, maybe it's from a person's personal fanzine. It's a little bit rambly, but I think it's really good. Of recent months, the digests and women's magazines have broken out in a rambling rash of rhetoric on the most unassailable of subjects, mother love. They are joyously enumerating the emotional and psychological pitfalls that lie in wait for the child cruelly deprived of the understanding and constant affection that only a mother can give. The cause is clearer than the complaint. During the war, when women were needed in factories and offices, group care for children received a tremendous impetus. Young girls as yet unmarried answered the call for labor power. Mature women with grown children tossed off their aprons with no great reluctance, and young wives and mothers by the thousands, women with young children and husbands overseas, leaped at the chance to make some money and to be doing something. Now the men have come home, and there aren't enough jobs to go round. For good, wholesome, frolicsome fantasy value, Henry Wallace's 60 million jobs is equaled only by the 2 chickens in every pot of 20 years ago. At the last reading, the number of unemployed had reached 3.5 million. What jobs there are, says good old reliable public opinion, must go to the men. The cover of the July 1945 issue, Volume 1, Give the Boys a Break, a good slogan, and with a veteran husband all my own, I'm in favor of it. Let's give the boys the jobs, the homes, the clothes and cars, and little luxuries they're entitled to. And maybe if the bright lads who dream up the slogans put their slick paper brains to work on getting the wheels of industry turning for peace, the boys would get all those things. But it's really so much easier to create a smug illusion of peace and prosperity by getting the little woman back to her ruffled apron at the kitchen sink and giving her job to her husband. The understanding fictionists and heartthrob psychologists assure us daily that whatever a woman may think she wants, she's really much happier in a submerged role as wife and mother and homemaker. Right after VE Day, we started getting these little gems about the working wife whose problems are all solved when she discovers she's pregnant, can't work, and is really in love with her husband. The only trouble with the idea was that so many of the little ladies didn't believe. They liked their jobs and in fact didn't want to leave them. So the sloganeers sicked the paper pulp industry on them. Now bland authority is issuing dire predictions about the terrible fate that lies in wait for the nursery-change child. Give the kids a break! I have a daughter, and I admit I'm partial to her, more than somewhat concerned about her present and future happiness, even if I do work for a living. My girl is past 3 now. She's been in nursery schools, full or part-time, for 2 years already, and if I stopped working tomorrow, I'd still whittle the family budget 6 ways at once to keep her there. I've had too good a chance to make comparisons, watching the children in my apartment house, and the ones who go to nursery school too. If it's giving the kids a break to coop them up in an apartment designed for adults, where mama's every other word of necessity is no, or don't touch, if it's giving them a break to let them play on the street under the guidance and training of older children better versed in street lore, I'll let mine go underprivileged in a nursery where shelves and sinks and furniture are designed to size, and built to withstand a child's powers of destruction, where a trained and interested person was with her all the time. If a child's psyche is really supposed to be better off under either the brooding care of full-power concentrated motherhood, or the nervous yelling of a woman with more work on her hands than she can manage, I'll let mine risk the deprivations of nursery school life. I've had some chance to compare mothers, too, the carriage-wheelers and the ones who go to work. Next time you run across one of these, the worst home is better than the nursery victims. Stop a minute and think about the homes you know. How many of the women you know are able to give their children as much as 1 full hour of attention during the day, are actually physically able to drop what they're doing at any moment to run and give Junior the admiration he wants and needs when he finishes building a particularly complicated blockhouse? And just in case the women you know all have maids, and you think overworked housewives and street playing are slum conditions, try this on for size, and see how it fits your preconceptions. In 1935-36, a good year, the prosperity just around the corner, approximately 1/2 of what the statisticians called economic units, which, on the average, is a family of 4, had incomes under $25 a week. I could go into rents, the cost of food and household help, and the etceteras, but it's hardly necessary to get a fair estimate of how much time Mother had for her 2 kids between laundry, cooking, cleaning, marketing, and making both ends meet. In the country where kids at least have all the room they need to run wild, this might not be so bad. In urban communities, I fail to see how the child benefits from home atmosphere. And what about the other half of the good homes, full of plenty of free time for the lady of the house? How many women do you know who really care for their children, who don't have a girl in the afternoons to take the baby off their hands for a while? Who wouldn't honestly rather go shopping, play bridge, work at the Red Cross, than stay home with the kids? What the self-styled authorities don't seem to know is that a real change has come over the world. The old cook stove is no more, and farm-sized families don't fit into city apartments. In the so-called good old days, when a woman had 5 to 10 children to care for, and a big house to take care of, she didn't have to worry either about utilizing her excess energies or about the children's play. They had plenty of space and a natural family group. We couldn't go back to that now, if we wanted to, and nobody really wants to. I think that's a really pretty good way to set up the situation around this story right here, That Only a Mother. This story was in fact written in 1946, shortly after the Second World War, and the piece that I just read was actually from the July 1945 Temper, the Family magazine, and I think it was the cover piece. So yeah, this one was written in 1946 while Judith's daughter, Merril, had measles and was, quote, cooped up indoors. And Judith's brief, intimate relationship with Ted Sturgeon was coming to a close. They remained friends until Ted's death. The inspiration, sort of, was an article in the New York Herald Tribune denying the rumors that infanticides were happening in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And she recalls seeing pictures of brain tumors and other such things, and missing limbs on experimental rats exposed to radiation in Scientific Monthly. And at the same time, she was working on a Western story for one of Robert Lowndes' magazines, and that was the ghostwriting gig. And she would keep this up to writing the sports stories for various magazines, and even the Toronto Star at one point. She wrote this story in 8 hours straight, with time out for calls from the other bedroom. So, I've read this story before doing this podcast. I'm guessing this is the first time for you guys?
Yeah.
Yes. This is my first ever Merril work that I've read.
Yeah, likewise.
Cool. Yeah, this is a story that I actually read for my science fiction class that I mentioned before on the podcast. The professor chose this. This was actually in the Science Fiction Hall of Fame book, I believe, the first one. A story that was well liked at the time. And yeah, we read this story. People were quite disturbed by this story, I think. They all had one big question, which I'll reveal at the end when we get there. It's probably the same question that we all have, but it's left ambiguous, so you can imagine it either way. But yeah, So what do you guys like this one?
Yeah, this is great.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this story.
Yeah, a lot of good social commentary, good style. I like how she plays with the formatting of including the letters and the telegrams and stuff like that. It's always nice when you get to end a story and it feels natural. Lends a nice touch to the world and the environment that you're reading. And also has, great monster appearance, which is, I don't know, it reminded me a lot of the film Combat Shock, if you've ever seen that one, which is basically, like this, but with Taxi Driver laid on top of it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's cool. You don't really know what the monster, like, you don't know what it looks like very much until the end, and you kind of slowly get a picture that all is maybe not what it seems.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's a really powerful reveal, for sure.
It's pretty subtle throughout, and then at the end it's quite shocking. But
yeah, I think that veneer of peace that was mentioned in that quote you read, that is what's happening, at the end, and you kind of see that taken to its extreme of this is the domesticity that's wanted while there's still such horrible things that are going on, such atrocities that can cause something like this.
Yeah. And she makes comments on this in her memoir, too, but she had arguments with, for example, Cyril Kornbluth, who served during World War II, and was very pro, he really stood behind what the Second World War stood for in terms of the American military involvement and stuff. And the way she put it, he said it was like a holy war against Hitler. And I think that a lot of people thought, it's after it's over and it'll be peaceful and stuff. But of course, I don't know, things started to heat up with the Soviet Union, and there was always the specter of looming atomic destruction in the air.
And there's certainly plenty of direct references to that in the story, talking about the bomb and the horrible effects of radiation that she no doubt saw from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as well as references to the actual program itself, the Oak Ridge Labs and all that stuff. So definitely going to be a major theme in science fiction stuff going forward, is the threat of nuclear apocalypse and all the horrible stuff that will fall out from that.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of definitely nuclear fallout, and I mean that literally and figuratively, in terms of how the science fiction stories of the day really depicted this apocalyptic scenario in so many different guises. We especially see it in the 50s, but this is definitely a concurrent example. We're in 1947, so everything is still fresh in everybody's minds, especially with the atom bombs being dropped on Japan. And Japan is a country she did stay in briefly for a while in the 60s too. So, Nate, you were asking earlier about Japanese translations, and I guess she felt confident enough to do this. So
yeah, she translated one or two stories in Japanese that appear in an anthology, which I thought was pretty interesting.
Yeah. Okay, so let's reveal this. So this is another short one, more so than the Keller, I'm going to suggest. To get the full effect of Judith and her prose and everything and the way the story goes, come back after you've read the story. Listen to the brief summary. But if you haven't read the story, read it first, because it's good. This was published in October 1947 in Astounding. And here we go. So, Margaret wakes up one morning in 1953, alone in her bed, in her place in New York City. And she's pregnant, and the doctor says she needs breakfast, but coffee's always been good enough for her. And she lives in a home with all mod cons. And Button starts the breakfast. The fax machine produces the newspapers, and there's some sort of war situation still. And her husband, Hank, has worked with radioactive materials, and Margaret's mother is worried about the baby. Margaret, though, has been reassured by her doctor. And after 5 months, they can always tell genetic abnormalities. Margaret works in an office building within walking distance. It's a desk farm, and she has her own computer. Fancy! She's just thinking about how everyone needs to work if they can, and she was warned by a psychologist once that she might be neurotic, so it's good that she has a job to go to when she has a dizzy spell. And her doctor enforces rest, and she writes a letter to her husband, Hank. And she's bothered reading about infanticides in the paper. It's always the husbands who kill the babies, and the juries don't convict. So yeah, we get some notes and telegrams back and forth from Hank and Maggie. And Maggie's baby was premature and put in an incubator. And she doesn't like the head nurse, who keeps going on obsessively about mutations. And she writes Hank that the baby's normal, though, and maybe just ugly. A face that only a mother would love. Hank's been in contact with the hospital, too, and they told him the baby is male. But Maggie insists it's a girl, and that she's taken her home already. So the months go by, and the notes from Maggie keep on coming, talking about how well their daughter's doing, enclosing film reels apparently sometimes. Now, after only a few months and no teeth, the baby has started to talk, Maggie says. And she's already got plans for a speech therapist. At 7 months, not only can she talk, but she can sing too. So almost a whole year passes, and finally we get a message from Hank, and he can have leave at last. It's December, and very obviously, baby is super intelligent, but still in a crib. And she can't go in the bathtub yet, and descriptions of her physicality are vague, but suggestive. Yeah, Daddy is expected, and Margaret is preparing a roast. I guess what I like about some of the descriptions we've had so far is, okay, if you know what's coming, or you know what kind of story this might be, based on everything I've said so far, you kind of have an idea what the descriptions mean, but they also could just be a baby, you know? Sometimes a baby does look like a potato in a sack. Right?
It is a nice touch, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. But while bathing, she reads the paper again, and there's more talk of mutations due to atomic bomb explosions, with Hiroshima and Nagasaki being name-checked. And yeah, this already happened in Japan, including the infanticides. So it was that stuff that made Hank quit his job and become a technical designer instead of a technician working directly with fissile materials. Hank arrives, and it's a joyous reunion, made strange by the passing of 18 months' time. And I don't know, I just can't help but feel this might mirror the way Judith felt when her husband came home from overseas. I don't know, it's like, it doesn't seem like the relationship lasted long after that at all. It's just like, I hardly know the guy now, right? It's almost,
right,
I don't know.
Right.
Yeah, Hank wanders around the place and ends up by the crypt. The baby's sleeping, and the covers get pulled back, and the baby says hello, and despite having heard the news earlier, Hank is astonished. The baby, finally given a name, Henrietta, starts to crawl, but needs to be turned over by Margaret. She's all done up tight in a nightie for the second time, is likened to a potato sack. And then Hank thinks of a worm. And slowly, and mostly by feeling around, he realizes the baby has no limbs, and her musculature is exposed. And his hand begins to tighten around the sack of flesh as he goes in hysterics. And there it ends. So, what do you think the burning question on everybody's mind was when they read this story?
I don't know. What was it?
Did he kill the baby?
Oh. I don't know.
Yeah, we don't know. It's fine. It's ambiguous. But it's just, you're under like a bunch of 19, 20-year-olds reading this story for the first time. Everybody was like, but we don't know. Did he kill the baby? Right? Like,
yeah, that never even entered my mind. So I guess I'd be in the no camp myself.
Yeah. I mean, all the hints of the infanticides and stuff, but I guess seem to be leading that way, but...
Yeah, I wouldn't have thought of it beforehand, but going through it again and thinking about those references, it does feel like it could be a possibility.
Yeah, and I think kind of goes back to what I was saying once about terror stories, and reading Brian Evenson in particular, and realizing that he cuts off almost all his stories before the big horror is revealed, like before the big moment. And some people would carry it one step further and describe that big moment, but he always cuts it off before you know for sure what or if it's going to happen, and that's more terrifying because you don't know, right? So you're left to think about it and imagine it, and she follows that principle in this for sure. I mean, hey, if you want to be an optimist, you could say, yeah, he freaks out, but she calms him down, and she's like, look, we can still do this. Our baby's super smart. She might look weird, but I mean, she can still have a future. I don't know. It's possible, but it's ambiguous. So I guess however your disposition is, however you'd be thinking at the time, is how you would feel about this, about whether he kills the baby or not. But yeah.
Yeah, I thought it was a more interesting commentary on her state of mind, hallucinating, being in this state of denial where she perceives reality as different than it actually is for, like a year or two?
Yeah.
Something like that?
It seems that way, but she also knows, right? Because she has to bathe baby, and she has to take care of baby, Henrietta, so she has this neurosis, and she talks about it, but she also recognizes it in a way, and I don't know, maybe she mostly wants to hide it from her husband, so she's kind of hiding it from herself. I mean, yeah. I don't know. To me, it's like, I get that part about, like, I mean, I'm certainly not going to judge her for it. It's that only a mother thing, right? It's like, it makes sense. I don't know. Who's to say how long that would carry on for? But, I mean, I know for sure, like, a lot of parents of disabled children are in denial, and they stay in denial for a really long time. But if you ask them, they'll tell you, yeah, we know that we know this and we understand this, but that doesn't mean they're willing to take on all the facets and the responsibilities and stuff like that, I guess.
Right.
It's something we've covered before, too. I mean, it does remind me of Alas All Thinking by Harry Bates. And sure, I kind of wonder if that was a story she probably would have read and thought about. And she doesn't mention Harry Bates in her memoirs, but I kind of wonder, like, and I guess he was kind of more old school and not in a different crowd and all that. But
yeah, I mean, this is well into the Campbell era of Astounding.
Yeah. But I remember commenting when we did that one, how I thought maybe the story would have been written a lot differently if it was post-World War II.
Oh, sure, yeah.
This definitely is less of an epic. It's more of like a weird, I guess, you could almost say it's like a slice of life of this woman's, her, pregnancy and her early experience with her atomic offspring daughter. So it's a very different kind of story, but I think it reflects some of the same concerns. And presumably, Henrietta, if she grew up, she would have to have mobility assistance of various kinds, and she would definitely she obviously has quite a brain, right? It's developed really quickly anyway.
Yeah.
That was something that Maggie did perceive accurately, is that she is very intelligent.
Yeah.
And so as far as I'm concerned, I mean, there's no reason why she can have a future. She didn't seem like she was in pain. That would have been the main thing, right? It was just like, yeah, I mean, being distorted by radiation could cause a lot of painful things, right? It's not just not being able to walk or not having, well, I mean, she also says her musculature was kind of exposed, like externalized, right? So that could be really dangerous for her too. So I don't know. She's talking about the infanticides, and it's like, I think that as a parent, right, you would want to put yourself in a position of, okay, my child may be different, but I still want them to have a future, and I still want them to be, I mean, this is a consequence of our actions and the society we live in, and maybe it shouldn't be this way, but my child doesn't deserve to die for that. So, and yeah, I mean, that's kind of why one must ask the question at the end, did he kill the baby? I guess to me that was my takeaway from it, more so than her particular neurosis about the child's disability or the child's radioactivity-induced birth conditions.
Right, yeah.
That was certainly a really interesting aspect. And we didn't really see a lot of Hank's letters, and they were all very clipped telegrams, so I don't know. Again, it's kind of, it feels like a very one-sided relationship as well at this point, although he seems happy enough to be home, but I don't know. Just here she is writing all these gushing letters and everything, and he's just like firing off these telegrams, presumably because that's what they did in the military, I guess. I don't know. Definitely an awesome piece. Liked it a lot. Really good to read a second time. And also to learn about Merril. And if you're interested, yeah, I would definitely suggest reading those memoirs. Like I say, they are fragmentary and a little bit disjointed due to the nature of the thing that she never really finished by herself. But there's a lot of interesting stuff there for science fiction fans of the American 40s, 50s scene, but also, I guess, residents of Toronto in particular, commenting on things that were happening later in the book, and transmigration to Canada and adopting Canadian citizenship and stuff like that. Moving in different circles entirely, but it never seemed like she really left a lot of those old figures behind, and it seemed like as she was getting older, she kind of started to feel really sad that a lot of them were dying before her. And she, I don't know, it seems like there was a lot of things she felt were unsaid, and it's something when you I guess, read the thoughts of an old person who's been through quite an interesting, hectic life, and there's just, I guess, a lot of regrets and emotions and different things that she had to go through, and with a lot of these people back in the 40s when she was younger, and so she's got a lot to say about it, and pretty much every person who was moving in the community at that time, she's got something to say about. And yeah, there were a lot of, from what people like her and Damon Knight tell, it was pretty steamy and sorted, with lots and lots of sleeping around and people not being very happy with each other and stuff like that. And unfortunately, when you get into settings like this, you have people with varying degrees of open-mindedness, and not everybody's really on the same page, and even if you spend a lot of time talking about it, at the end, feelings of possessiveness and jealousy and prudishness and all kinds of different things still come up. So, even though most of these people were, as she said, very left-wing, there are certainly some reactionary attitudes, and she calls out Don Wollheim in particular. But, yeah. So, interesting stuff. Great story. Definitely recommend. I'm glad you guys like this one, too.
Yeah, no, this is great.
I kind of felt like I had to put this one in, as we were kind of talking about what to do for this story, this episode. And I'm like, yeah, that one's one that has to be there, so, yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad this one was chosen, and I think it does fit in really well with the other stories.
Yeah, for sure.
All right. Well, time to visit with an author we've already spent a little bit of time with on the podcast, E.M. Forster.